We begin in British Columbia, where today Prime Minister Mark Carney met with coastal First Nations to discuss major projects. The meeting comes after the federal government signed a memorandum of understanding with Alberta, which includes a path forward for a possible oil pipeline and the lifting of an oil tanker ban along BC's north coast. Gaagwiis Jason Alsop is president of the Haida Nation, and he joins me now. Gaagwiis, it's good to see you again. Thank you for being here, sir.
Hi, David. Good afternoon. Good to be here.
Based on your comments when you came out of the meeting, it's very clear your position hasn't changed on an oil pipeline. I'm curious whether the Prime Minister or anyone else tried to convince you to change your mind in your conversations today.
No, it was a very productive meeting with the Prime Minister today. And like he said, it was really about building relationships and starting a face-to-face dialogue around areas that we can find alignment and where we can work together amongst the coastal nations and Canada.
Where were things, though, on the idea of the bitumen pipeline to Prince Rupert, of lifting the tanker ban? Because the Prime Minister, his key ministers, members of the government talk about this as a national imperative, the need to get this economic activity in the face of what Donald Trump is doing. What was the message from the government to you and the others in the room on that front today, sir?
Well, the message from the government was that, there is a commitment to building a relationship, to the journey of reconciliation and finding areas of alignment. I think there was also more clarity from the Prime Minister's office around his major projects office and his process for how that work is to unfold, and some productive discussions around what that looks like in terms of free, prior and informed consent and UNDRIP and how that could be done in a way that does seek consent.
So what clarity did they give you on that front? Because I know this has been something people are wondering about, right? That consultation is not a veto, and approval and consent are consultation and consent are different things, is how a lot of people are talking about it. How did the Prime Minister explain to you today how he views those principles?
Well, obviously there's a legal requirement to consult and accommodate as the bare minimum, but ultimately that we need to work together and that we need to form relationships, and that we were clear about our position that we would like the Oil Tanker Moratorium Act to stay in place, but there are other things we got to look at in terms of the other nation-building projects that were announced and the impacts those have on the territory and the positive work we could do together. And I think it was clear that just because projects do make that list, there still is a process to go through. There's still a lot of work to actually get to a project delivery. And although there's need for action to respond to the economic challenges, there's still process, there's still due diligence and a lot of good work that needs to happen.
There were some measures today based on the statements coming from both sides of the conversation on extending funding for the Oceans Protection Plan Reconciliation Framework Agreement, extending the leases on towboats, for lack of a better term. These sorts of things to focus on coastal protection in the wake of the concerns of the increased economic activity from the other projects. But what was your sense, Gaagwiis, on how determined the federal government is to see a pipeline that goes to the northwest coast? Did you get the sense that this is a true imperative and priority for them, or an option they are merely considering?
Well, we focused again on the areas of alignment. My sense is it is, obviously it's an option and was put on the table in the MOU with Alberta, and something considering the challenges, economic challenges and the relationship with the United States is something he needs to consider to be a responsible leader. But ultimately we focused a lot of the dialogue around, again, these other nation building projects that were announced, and really making clear that outside of the pipeline, with existing projects, existing shipping traffic, and the proposed increases exponentially over 217% in the coming years, the coast is not prepared for the existing traffic, let alone introducing something like bitumen tankers.
So in terms of dealing with that issue, because I know this was a concern you raised when we last spoke, I believe when you were here for the vote on the on one of the pipeline votes in Parliament, beyond the expansion of the funding for the protection plan, what sort of progress are you going to see, do you think, or were you promised coming out of this on those areas of alignment to better protect the coastline from what's going to be pretty robust activity, whether or not there is a pipeline?
Yeah, well, we'll leave it up to the government to make their formal announcements on things, but I think what was landed from our side was for him to get grounded in the coast, in the realities that we face as coastal communities, as nations, and to understand that that work is imperative. So it does allow us to be able to actually implement the agreements that we already have in a hopefully a faster and a more effective way to address our current challenges and prepare for future increases in shipping. So I think it was, as he said, it was a relationship building meeting. It wasn't about big announcements and that work necessarily, but obviously we touched on these existing agreements and the work we have to continue to invest in addressing the existing shipping traffic, as well as implementing marine protected areas along the Haida Gwaii North Coast and Central Coast.
So where does this relationship building go from here? I know this was the first face-to-face, and they came to you on the way to China, which I know was an important thing to see happen. What's the next step? Presumably, this is not a one-off, that there will be more meetings. Where does it go from here, Gaagwiis?
Well, it was an important sign of respect by Prime Minister Carney to accept the invitation that we were making, well, we've made personally and publicly in response to the MOU. Next is to follow up on the discussions and the commitments that were made to really pick up the pace of implementation of our agreements and move that work forward. And, as that begins to accelerate and unfold, we will need to be in constant dialogue and checking in as the nation building projects on the major projects list continue to progress, and ensure that there is good communication and this relationship continues to build as those processes unfold.
Okay, I know you said you wanted to leave it to the government to announce what they've decided on. I'm not trying to trap you or trick you, because they've sent us a statement, and they talk about the Prime Minister committed to renewing funding for the ocean protection plan that we talked about and coming back with something in 26-27, reaffirm the commitment to conserving 30% of land and water by 2030, including working with the First Nations on identified marine protected areas in the Great Bear Sea. And to strengthen ocean protection, they will also fund a marine traffic risk assessment study, extend the leases of 2 emergency towing vessels until 2028, and ensure that towing capacity is consistent with shipping activity. Does that cover it, or is there more to come beyond that from today?
That does cover most of what was discussed today, and I think it's important for everyone to understand that those are really pre-existing agreements and arrangements that this government is now really committing to. It is work that has been well underway, that that the nations have been leading and working with BC and Canada, but this will allow us to continue that work, but also the Prime Minister's commitment to, make it a priority and to speed things up. He is he's spoke about leading with action and results, and that's what we expect to see in implementing these agreements and being able to see those improvements on the ground in our ability to respond and look after our ocean territory.
So just as a final question before I let you go, there has been some criticism of the way this Prime Minister and the government under his leadership have approached issues with First Nations and Indigenous peoples in terms of consultation and meeting. But it sounds like today, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, so tell me if I'm wrong, that you felt respected and heard today. Do you feel better about things? Am I understanding this correctly?
We do. I think we see it as a sign of respect, and I think it's really important for us, and we shared with the Prime Minister our respect for leadership, for the leadership challenge that he faces in keeping the country together and responding to economic challenges and addressing the budget and trying to make sure that, you know, all of there's fragile systems right now, the economic system, ecosystems, relationships with each other, relationships between the province and the federal government, relationships with Indigenous people. So we understand the complexity, the challenge he faces, and he got out the gates, trying to show that action and having to travel the world and do everything, perhaps wasn't able to make those early contacts, but, we're here now, and this reconciliation process is a journey. It's not a transactional relationship. It's something that we all need to commit to and keep working on to adapt to the challenges we all face.
Gaagwiis,
see the opportunity.
Right. Yeah. Well, Gaagwiis, it was good to see you again. It's good to speak with you again. This is Gaagwiis, President of the Haida Nation. Thank you for your time on a busy day, sir. We appreciate it.
Howard, David, take care.
Thank you. So today's meeting with the Prime Minister, it hasn't changed the Coastal First Nations' objections to a pipeline to the BC coast, but how much does that matter if there's still no private sector proponent who's come forward to build the pipeline? Joining me now is Sonya Savage. She is a former Alberta Minister of Energy and a former Alberta Minister of the Environment, and of course, lots of experience in the oil sector. Sonya Savage, it's good to see you. Thank you for being here today.
Well, thanks for having me.
So even before we get to the objections of the First Nations in British Columbia, this is a pipeline that no one in the private sector has agreed to build yet. So under current conditions, how likely is it that a private proponent will come forward?
Well, I think what we're seeing now is with the situation in Venezuela and the Americans taking control of Venezuela oil, that it's now become a political imperative. It's a national interest imperative to get a new coastal pipeline built. And we've seen a lot of de-risking of that through the Memorandum of Understanding to take away a lot of the political and regulatory and policy risk. But there's still some commercial uncertainty for companies to be able to commit to long-term shipping commitments to make the pipeline economical. So we've got a lot more political uncertainty. We have a political and national interest imperative, but there's some more work to do on making it a commercial reality.
So you had said in an interview, I believe with my colleague Kathleen Petty, that without some sort of a government guarantee, a pipeline simply isn't viable. No private sector proponent's going to come forward. Does Venezuela change that opinion, or is that just something that you sort of have to set aside as you look at the bottom line here?
Well, I think there is a concern that oil, and we've heard President Trump say he wants to keep oil prices low, and at $50 a barrel oil, that's going to be very challenging for companies to be able to commit to long-term shipping agreements. And remember, a lot of these companies and pipeline companies too are once bitten, twice shy. They've had projects fail before with getting into regulatory and political hurdles. So I think we're going to need to see some sort of de-risking of a pipeline, and that doesn't have to be equity ownership, government owning it. There can be a number of ways to de-risk a pipeline. It can be funding Indigenous equity through loan guarantees. It can be helping Indigenous groups become equity partners. It can be in the form of the government of Alberta taking a shipping commitment with royalty in kind barrels. It can be putting a backstop on what a toll would be, what the cost of shipping would be. And that's not unusual. That happened in the 1970s when Line 9 was built. There was a backstop on the tolls so that companies knew what the price was going to be, that it wasn't going to be any higher. So it can come in all sorts of forms. It can also come in terms of putting a lot more infrastructure in on the coast for marine safety. So it can come in all sorts of forms, but I think we're going to need to see something for the private sector to step up.
Well, look, the oil response improvements. I think that's a given if this somehow goes ahead. But in terms of giving, that satisfies the concerns of the coastal First Nations, right? But in terms of giving that financial certainty on the pipeline, on the barrels, I mean, is this a federal government investment? Is it provincial government? Is it both? How do you see it going?
Well, I think there's going to be some conversations along the way of who would be able to step forward. Both the federal government and the provincial government have Indigenous equity programs, the AIOC in Alberta. Federal government has a similar program. So they both have some infrastructure on how to de-risk these projects. The province has the ability to commit barrels on the line. But this isn't, just remember, there is nothing new about this in Canada to backstop and help de-risk pipelines. In the 1950s, the federal government, C.D. Howe, backstopped and underwrote the building of the Trans-Canada Main Line to make sure it's an all-Canadian route across northern Canada. They set up a Crown corporation and they owned part of it. It wouldn't have been built without that government's intervention. Same with Line 9, same with TMX wouldn't have been built without the federal government stepping in. And so this isn't anything new. And I think now what we're seeing now is there is a political urgency. There is a national imperative to move this kind of project quickly at a time when there's more commercial risk and commercial uncertainty. So if we want to move it fast, if we want to move it quickly, if we want to move it ahead of when companies are prepared to commit, we will have to see some government intervention.
But what does that say about the viability of this entire project, that it requires extraordinary intervention from the government to get it to a point where it can go ahead? Like is it worthwhile if this is what it takes?
It's a national imperative. Right now, we've seen it play out. It's more important to build a North Coast and a West Coast pipeline now than it was when Northern Gateway went before the National Energy Board. And that's because we've seen how things have played out in the last 10 years. We only have one market for our product. That's the United States takes 90% of Canadian oil production. Only 10% gets to alternate markets. And now in the United States, we're seeing competition from other heavy sources of oil from Venezuela. We're seeing our longest trading partner having alternative sources of supply. So now it's more of a national imperative than ever before. And again, it's not uncommon to see these types of projects de-risked. In fact, it's more common to see them de-risked and built with some government intervention than not. The only time where pipelines really moved forward without government intervention was between the time of, say, 2005 and 2010, when Alberta Clipper was built, the first Keystone pipeline was built, when Line 3 was proposed, and when there was Line 9 was reversed. So there was a period of time when government backstop wasn't factored in, wasn't needed, but this is not unusual to require some government de-risking.
Well, you say it's a national imperative, and I understand the impulse for that and why people are making the argument. You just look at what's happening in the United States hour by hour, day by day, and you understand why you want to look for alternate markets. But it is not a First Nations imperative, at least not in the center and north coast of BC and on Haida Gwaii. So you can come up with all kinds of federal or provincial financial instruments to help move this along. That seems like an unchangeable position, at least in what we've heard to now.
Well, there's certain groups, Coastal First Nations is opposed to it. That's nothing new, too. They came out in 2010 when Northern Gateway was first entering into the regulatory process with their own declaration and their own tanker moratorium, and they haven't budged from that. The project was approved by the National Energy Board, by the Joint Review Panel, as being in the national interests then. At that time, there was a number of First Nations that were supporting the project and who would have been taking an equity stake in it. Fast forward to today, we still see the opposition of coastal First Nations, which again, that's an organization, that isn't individual rights holders, individual nations. It's more an advocacy group.
Right, but the individual nations are not on board either. Like, you know, all the ones who have spoken publicly along the route, and particularly at the endpoint along the coast, like they're just not there, right? So
well, at the end of Northern Gateway, there was about 30 equity partners who would stand to be owners of the Northern Gateway pipeline. I suspect that number, and that wasn't going to be majority ownership, that was going to have an equity stake. I think now to build any major infrastructure project like a pipeline, you're going to have significant material Indigenous equity ownership. They have to have a large partnership in this, and by a large partnership, it's not just ownership. They're going to need to be involved in the pipeline safety and monitoring and ensuring that it's safe, and that would be including on the coast. So I think you're going to be able to get that. I know the government of Alberta, Minister Carney, is working hard on finding a path forward. At the end of the day, when Northern Gateway was vetoed by the federal government, there was significant support for it by a number of First Nations who would have had a lot to gain economically.
well, it was also, its approval was overturned by the court before the government did effectively kill it. Well, its approval was because of lack of consultation. And then the government did put the knife in it. No, I'm not going to disagree there.
So you can't rewrite history. On paragraph 344 of the court judgment, the federal court judgment on Northern Gateway, the court said consultation was not complete.
Right.
And the court set out a whole roadmap on what steps need to be done. And it said there was 4 phases of consultation. Government met the test in 3, and on phase 4, there was some steps to be complete. Would take about 4 months.
Right.
The government, instead of completing the consultation, vetoed it. So at that point, there was a roadmap forward. There was a regulatory decision approving Northern Gateway and a court decision that said you need to complete the consultation. That's the same thing that happened in TMX, and the government chose to complete the consultation there. So we can get there again, and I think now that it's a national imperative to get some new access to new markets, I think we can, and we have to get there.
Okay, we're out of time. Former Alberta Energy Minister Sonya Savage, appreciate your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.